The winter of 1888 didn't just bring snow to the Montana Territory. It brought a reckoning. For Elara, a woman clinging to a desolate homestead survival was a daily battle against the cold. But the real storm broke when she found him a man near death in the icy grip of Miller's Creek, his blood a stark sin against the snow. She dragged the devil from the water, only to have the angel of justice knock on her door. But in the untamed West, she'd soon learn that a lawman's badge and a bandit's brand could be two sides of the same tarnished coin. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that stalked the narrow valley where Elara's cabin clung to the earth like a desperate prayer. It was late November 1888, and the first serious snow of the season had buried the Montana landscape in a shroud of blinding white. For 3 days the world had been a maelstrom of wind and ice. Now an unnerving silence had fallen, broken only by the groan of burdened pine boughs and the distant mournful cry of a lone wolf. Elara adjusted the thick wool scarf wrapped around the lower half of her face, her breath instantly freezing against the fabric. Her worn leather gloves, patched and repatched, did little to fend off the gnawing ache in her fingers as she gripped the handle of the axe. Splitting wood was a man's chore, her late husband Thomas had always said. But Thomas was 2 years gone, taken by a fever that had swept through the valley like a phantom, leaving her the sole custodian of their hard-won 160-acre homestead. She was 26, but the harshness of this life had etched faint lines around her eyes, the same way the relentless wind carved patterns into the surrounding rock. The thwack of the axe, biting into a seasoned log, was a satisfying, solitary sound. It was proof of life, proof of her own stubborn endurance. Each swing was a defiance of the elements, of the loneliness of the whispers from folks back in Willow Creek that a woman alone couldn't possibly manage. She had managed. She'd learned to set snares, to mend fences, to shoot straight, and to trust the silence more than she had trusted most people. It was on her 4th trip from the woodpile to the cabin, her arms laden with the precious fuel, that she saw it. A smudge of darkness against the pristine white expanse of the frozen Miller's Creek, which snaked its way through the lower end of her property. It was perhaps 100 yards away, a stark anomaly in the monochromatic landscape. A fallen branch, a shadow, curiosity, a luxury she rarely afforded herself, pricked at her. She set the wood down on the porch, her eyes squinting against the glare. It hadn't been there this morning when she'd hauled water from the well. She grabbed the Winchester rifle that leaned always by the door, its cold, smooth stock a familiar comfort in her hand, and began to trudge through the knee-deep snow. The going was slow. The snow fought her with every step, a soft, yielding resistance that stole her warmth and breath. As she drew closer, the dark shape resolved itself. It wasn't a branch. It was too large, too slumped. It was a figure. A human figure, half submerged in the icy water where the creek's current had resisted the final complete freeze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the vast quiet. Her first instinct was fear. This was Injun territory, though the Crow were mostly peaceful these days. More likely, it was a trapper who'd misjudged the ice, or a prospector who'd lost his way. But no one had any business being on her land. She chambered around the metallic snick of the action, unnaturally loud. "Hello," she called out, her voice thin in the frigid air. There was no response. The figure remained unnervingly still. 50 yards. 40. She could see more clearly now. It was a man, face down in the water. A thick buffalo coat was soaked and heavy, anchoring him to the creek bed. A dark, almost black stain was spreading slowly from his side, melting a small halo in the snow and ice along the bank. Blood. A lot of it. Caution warred with a deeper, more ingrained instinct, the one that made you pull a newborn calf from a mire or shelter a lost lamb from a storm. This was a human being. She couldn't just leave him to die. Cursing her own compassion, she picked up her pace, the rifle held at the ready. When she reached the bank, the scene was even grimmer. The man's hat was gone, revealing a mess of dark, matted hair. His face was turned away from her, submerged. She didn't know if he was alive, but she could see the ragged tear in his coat and the shirt beneath. It was a bullet wound. She was sure of it. "Mister," she said, her voice now just a few feet away. She prodded his shoulder with the barrel of the Winchester. He was heavy, inert. For a moment she thought he was dead. Then a shudder racked his body, a weak, convulsive tremor that ended in a low groan, the sound muffled by the water. He was alive. "Damnation," she whispered to the uncaring sky. This was a trouble she did not need. A wounded man meant questions. It meant whoever shot him might still be around. It meant everything she'd fought to build here, this quiet, solitary peace, was about to be shattered. But leaving him was not an option. It wasn't in her. She laid the rifle on the snowy bank within easy reach. Gritting her teeth against the biting cold, she waded into the creek. The water was a shock of liquid ice, instantly soaking through her boots and the hem of her woolen dress, stealing the breath from her lungs. She hooked her arms under his shoulders, pulling with all her might. He was a dead weight made heavier by the waterlogged coat. "Come on, you fool, man," she grunted, straining. "Don't you die on me now. You're not worth the trouble of burying." With a final desperate heave, she dragged him out of the water and onto the snow-covered bank. She rolled him over. His face was pale as death, a canvas of blues and whites. A dark stubble covered his jaw, and a fresh cut bled sluggishly on his forehead. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30. Despite the blood and the grime, his features were sharp, almost handsome in a rugged, angular way. His breathing was shallow, a faint rasp in his chest. His eyes fluttered open. They were a startlingly clear blue, clouded with pain and confusion. They focused on her for a fleeting second before rolling back into his head. But in that brief moment, she saw not just pain, but a flicker of something else, something wild and untamed, the look of a cornered wolf. She worked quickly, her hands clumsy with cold. She unbuttoned the massive coat. Beneath it, his shirt was a sodden crimson mess. The bullet had gone in his left side, just above the hip. It looked bad. She wasn't a doctor, but she'd seen enough wounds on livestock and on men to know that a gut shot in the middle of nowhere in this cold was a death sentence. Unless. She looked from the unconscious man to her cabin, a thin plume of smoke rising from its chimney like a fragile signal of hope. It was a quarter-mile back to the house, all of it uphill through deep snow. Dragging him would be a Herculean task, one that would drain every last ounce of her strength. And for what? For a stranger, a man who'd been shot. Likely a man who'd deserved it. Bandits' rustlers claimed jumpers. The territory was crawling with them. Men like this brought nothing but grief. She should just take his gun. She could see the butt of a Colt peacemaker tucked into his belt and leave him to his fate. It was the smart thing to do. The safe thing. She looked down at his face again. A snowflake landed on his eyelash, and for a ridiculous, heart-wrenching moment, it looked like a tear. "Damn it all to hell," she muttered. She stood up, took a deep breath, and began the impossible task of dragging the wounded bandit home. The journey back to the cabin was a blur of burning lungs and screaming muscles. Elara fashioned a crude travois from his heavy coat, tying the sleeves together and looping them over her shoulders. She pulled, and the man slid over the snow, his head lolling, leaving a smeared pinkish trail in his wake. Every few yards, she had to stop leaning over her knees, gasping for air that felt like shards of ice in her throat. The silence of the valley was now filled with her own ragged breathing and the soft, dragging hiss of the body behind her. By the time she reached the porch, dusk was painting the western sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. She was soaked, freezing, and utterly exhausted. With one last surge of adrenaline, she managed to haul him up the 3 steps and through the cabin door, collapsing onto the rough-hewn floorboards beside him. For a long moment, she just lay there. The warmth of the cabin's single room, a blissful shock. The fire in the stone hearth crackled a welcome. Outside, the wind was beginning to pick up again, a low, mournful howl that seemed to underscore her isolation. She had brought the trouble inside. Pushing herself up, she surveyed the man. He was still unconscious, a pale, bleeding wreck on her floor. First things first. She stripped off his wet gear with a grim determination, her movements practical and devoid of modesty. The heavy coat, the sodden shirt, the leather vest, the gun belt. She paused at the gun belt, her fingers hesitating over the Colt. It was a fine weapon, well oiled and cared for. She removed it and the knife sheathed on his other hip and placed them on the high mantelpiece well out of his reach. The wound was ugly. It was a deep, ragged hole, weeping blood sluggishly. It hadn't passed through. The bullet was still in there, a leaden poison. She knew enough to know it had to come out. For the next hour, she worked with a frantic, focused energy. She stoked the fire, put a large kettle of water on to boil, and tore strips from one of her few clean linen sheets. From a small wooden chest, she retrieved her medical supplies, a bottle of whiskey, a sharp skinning knife, and a pair of pliers. It was a crude surgeon's kit, but it was all she had. She cleaned the wound as best she could, her touch surprisingly gentle. The man groaned and stirred his body, tensing under her hands. But he didn't wake. Good. This would be easier for both of them. Pouring a liberal amount of whiskey over the wound and onto the knife, she took a deep breath, offered a silent, desperate prayer, and began to probe for the bullet. It was a gruesome, bloody business. The feeling of the knife moving inside another human being was sickening, but she forced herself to concentrate, to be methodical. Twice she had to stop to fight back waves of nausea. The cabin filled with the coppery smell of blood and the sharp scent of whiskey. Finally, she felt the telltale scrape of steel on lead. Using the pliers, she latched on and with a sickening tug, pulled the flattened piece of metal free. She dropped it into a small bowl with a clatter. It was misshapen ugly. A .44 caliber slug, most likely. She cleaned the wound again, packed it with a poultice of yarrow she kept dried for just such emergencies, and bandaged it tightly with the linen strips. She managed to get him out of his wet trousers and into a dry pair of Thomas's old long johns, then dragged him onto the spare cot in the corner of the room. She covered him with every spare blanket she owned. Only then, when the immediate crisis was over, did she allow herself to collapse into a chair by the fire. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a tremor in her hands. She looked at the man on the cot. His breathing was a little easier now, a little deeper. A fever was already setting in. She could see the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. The next 48 hours would tell the tale. She had saved his life for now. But what life had she saved, and what would be the cost? 2 days passed in a tense, watchful haze. The storm returned with a vengeance, isolating the cabin completely. Elara tended to the stranger, forcing sips of broth and willow bark tea between his feverish lips. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering names she didn't recognize, Jed, Blackwood, or Lillian, and phrases that hinted at a life of violence and flight. "They're coming. The whole posse. Got a ride." In his brief moments of lucidity, his blue eyes would fix on her with a raw, animal suspicion. He never spoke a coherent word to her, but his gaze was unnerving. It held no gratitude, only a guarded watchfulness. She learned his name was Cole from a faded letter she found in his discarded vest. A desperate, pleading letter from a woman named Lillian, begging him to come home. On the third morning, the fever broke. He woke up, and this time the clarity in his eyes remained. He pushed himself up on one elbow, hissing in pain as the movement pulled at his stitches. Where am I?" he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "My cabin," Elara said, simply not moving from her chair by the fire. She had her Winchester resting across her lap. "You were in the creek. Shot." He looked down at his bandaged side, then back at her. The suspicion in his eyes deepened. "Who are you? The woman who pulled you out. Elara Hayes." You patched me up. Someone had to. The bullet's out. The rest is up to you and God." He sank back onto the cot, his gaze sweeping the small, tidy cabin. It took in the neatly stacked wood, the sparse but clean furniture, the drying herbs hanging from the rafters. His eyes lingered on the mantelpiece where his Colt and knife rested. "You're alone here," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I am," she said, her grip tightening on the rifle. A long silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions. He was assessing her, she knew, gauging her strength, her weakness. She was doing the same. He was a bandit, a wanted man. She was sure of it. But there was something in his face, a weariness that went beyond his physical injury, that gave her pause. "I'm grateful," he said finally, the word sounding foreign on his tongue. "My name's Cole." "I know," she replied. "Lillian seems to miss you." A shadow passed over his face, a flicker of pain that had nothing to do with his wound. He didn't respond. That afternoon the snow stopped. The sun, weak and watery, broke through the clouds, making the new-fallen snow glitter with a painful brilliance. And with the break in the weather came a new sound, the rhythmic crunch of hooves in snow. Elara's head snapped up. Cole heard it too. He struggled to sit up, his face a mask of alarm. "Someone's coming," he hissed, his eyes darting towards the door, then to his gun on the mantel. "Stay put," Elara ordered, grabbing her rifle and moving to the single window. She peered cautiously through the edge of the glass. 2 riders were making their way up the track to her cabin. They were moving slowly, their horses struggling in the deep drifts. One man was heavy-set, bundled in a thick coat, his face red from the cold. The other was tall and lean in the saddle, wearing a long, dark coat that stood out against the snow. Even from this distance, she could see the glint of metal on his chest. A badge. A lawman. Her blood ran cold. She had harbored a wounded man, likely a fugitive. In the eyes of the law, that made her an accomplice. They could arrest her, burn her cabin, take everything she had fought so hard to protect. She turned from the window, her face pale. Cole was watching her, his expression grim. He had seen the truth in her eyes. "Law," he whispered. She gave a single sharp nod. He swung his legs off the cot, hissing in pain, but forcing himself to stand. He swayed on his feet, one hand pressed to his bandaged side. "My gun?" he demanded, his voice low and urgent. "Give me my gun." "No," she said flatly. "There'll be no gunfight in my house. You'll get us both killed. They'll hang me." He shot back, his blue eyes blazing with a desperate fire. "I won't hang. Not for this." "Then what?" she challenged. "You can barely stand. You'll never outrun them." The hoofbeats were closer now. They would be at her door in a minute. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She looked from the desperate wounded man before her to the implacable justice riding towards her door. She was trapped. A heavy knock echoed through the cabin. "Hello, anyone in there?" a voice called out, deep and authoritative. "This is U.S. Marshal Blackwood." At the name, Cole froze. A look of utter disbelief, followed by a dawning, terrible understanding, washed over his face. He stared at the door as if he'd seen a ghost. "Blackwood." He breathed the name, a poisoned whisper. "Jed." Elara stared at him, confused. Before she could ask, the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Mrs. Hayes, we know you're in there. Open the door. We're looking for a fugitive." Elara's mind raced. To deny it was foolish. They must have tracked him here. Her trail dragging him from the creek would have been as clear as a map. She looked at Cole, at his shocked, pale face, and then at the door. Her hand, steady until now, began to tremble. She had pulled a wounded bandit from the creek, and now his brother wearing a marshal's badge was at her door. The trouble she had brought inside was about to tear her world apart. With a heavy heart and no other choice, she walked to the door and lifted the latch. The man who stood on her porch was the mirror image of the one lying wounded on her cot. He was taller, broader in the shoulders, and carried himself with an air of unshakable authority. But the face was the same angular jaw, the same dark hair, the same startlingly blue eyes. Where Cole's were guarded and walled, this man's were sharp, piercing, and accustomed to command. A silver star was pinned to his heavy wool coat, glinting in the pale afternoon sun. U.S. Marshal Jedediah Blackwood. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low baritone that rumbled with power. He swept his hat off, revealing a face weathered by the elements, but marked by a stern sort of handsomeness. His eyes flicked past her into the dim interior of the cabin. "I'm Marshal Blackwood. This is Deputy Miller." He gestured to the stout man behind him, who gave a curt nod. Elara's heart was a trapped bird beating against her ribs. She kept her body framed in the doorway, blocking his view as much as possible. "Marshal, what can I do for you?" "We're tracking a man," Blackwood said, his gaze unwavering. "Wounded, escaped from the prison wagon transport over near Bear's Tooth, passed 2 days ago. He shot a guard. We followed his trail this far." His eyes dropped for a second to the disturbed snow near her porch, to the faint, almost erased signs of the travois. "Looks like you might have had a visitor." It was a statement, not a question. There was no point in lying. "He's inside," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He was in the creek. I couldn't just leave him." A muscle tightened in the marshal's jaw. Without another word, he pushed past her into the cabin. Deputy Miller followed his hand, resting on the butt of his holstered pistol. Marshal Blackwood stopped dead just inside the door. His sharp eyes immediately found the man on the cot. For a long moment, the cabin was utterly silent, charged with a tension so thick it felt hard to breathe. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the ragged breathing of the two brothers as they stared at each other across the small room. "Cole," the Marshal breathed. The single word was freighted with a lifetime of history, a complex cocktail of anger, regret, and something that looked painfully like affection. Cole pushed himself further up his face, a pale mask of defiance. "Jed." He spat the name in accusation. "Fancy seeing you here. Come to finish the job. The job is to take you back to Deer Lodge to stand trial," Jedediah said, his voice hardening, his professional mask snapping back into place. "You shot Deputy Franklin." "He drew on me first," Cole retorted, his voice rising. "They were going to kill me out on that road, and you know it. You're a convicted bank robber and an escaped felon." Jedediah stated, his voice cold as the iron of a cell door. "What did you expect, a feather bed and a warm meal?" He took a step forward. Elara flinched, instinctively moving to place herself between them. "Marshal, please. He's badly wounded. He's lost a lot of blood." Jedediah's piercing gaze turned to her. He took in her disheveled state, the water stains on her dress, the exhaustion etched onto her face. He glanced at the bloody bandages, the bowl with the misshapen slug, and the whiskey bottle on the table. "You took the bullet out?" he asked, a note of surprise in his voice. "I did," she said, lifting her chin. "I wouldn't do less for a sick animal." The corner of his mouth quirked in a humorless smile. "My brother has always had a knack for finding shelter with kind-hearted women. It's a pity he always repays that kindness with ruin." He looked back at Cole. "Get your things. What's left of them. We're leaving." "He can't ride Marshal," Elara protested. "A trip like that will kill him." "That's his concern, not mine," Jedediah said flatly. "And it should be yours, ma'am, that you're harboring a known outlaw. I could arrest you for this." "Then do it," she challenged, her fear eclipsed by a rising tide of anger. "I saved a man's life. If that's a crime in your book, then your law is colder than this winter." For the first time, the Marshal seemed to truly see her. He studied her face, the defiance in her eyes, the set of her jaw. He was a man who understood strength, and he recognized it in her. "The law is the law, Mrs. Hayes. It's what separates us from the animals." He turned to his deputy. "Miller, fetch the shackles." Cole struggled to his feet, swaying dangerously. "You're not putting those on me, Jed. Not in here." The air crackled. It was more than a confrontation between a lawman and an outlaw. It was a deeply personal battle. The love and hate between the two brothers was a palpable force in the small room. "It's Marshal Blackwood to you," Jedediah said, his voice dangerously low. "And you'll do as you're told." "Like I always did." Cole sneered, a bitter, painful grin, twisting his lips. "Following my big brother. Look where it got us. You with a tin star bought with lies, and me with a hole in my side. I warned you, Cole. I told you to stay away from that gang. I told you Silas Croft was poison. And you were the one who introduced me to him," Cole roared, taking a shaky step forward. "At the Blackwater Saloon. Don't you stand there on your high horse and pretend you didn't know what he was." Jedediah flinched as if struck. "I thought he was just a card sharp. I didn't know he was robbing trains." "You knew enough. You knew he was crooked, and you left me with him because you were sweet on the banker's daughter, Lillian." Elara's breath caught in her throat. Lillian. The name from Cole's fevered ramblings. The woman from the letter. She had been Jedediah's sweetheart. The story was becoming more tangled, more tragic with every word. "Leave her out of this," Jedediah commanded, his face turning to stone. "I can't," Cole whispered, his voice cracking. "She's the reason for all of it, isn't she? You wanted the respectable life she offered. You pushed me away into Croft's arms so you'd look clean. You bought that badge with my freedom. That's a lie." Jedediah thundered, his composure finally breaking. He took a step towards his brother, his hand clenched into a fist. "Is it?" Cole challenged, his blue eyes boring into his brother's. "Tell me it's a lie, Jed. Look me in the eye and tell me you didn't know what you were doing." Jedediah stopped. He couldn't say it. The silence that followed was more damning than any confession. He couldn't meet his brother's gaze. The rigid lawman, the unshakable Marshal, looked away. Elara watched them, her heart aching. This was not a simple matter of right and wrong, of law and chaos. This was a family tragedy, a story of betrayal and broken trust played out against the unforgiving backdrop of the frontier. She had saved one brother only to deliver him to the other, and in doing so had stumbled into the heart of their private war. Deputy Miller returned, dangling a pair of heavy iron shackles. The metallic jangle cut through the tense silence. "Marshal?" Miller asked, looking uncertainly between the two brothers. Jedediah seemed to pull himself back from the brink. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and his face hardened once more, the mask of the lawman firmly back in place. "Shackle him," he ordered, his voice devoid of all emotion. Cole didn't resist. The fight seemed to have drained out of him, replaced by a profound, hollow weariness. He held out his wrists as Deputy Miller clamped the cold iron around them. The finality of the act, the metallic click of the lock, echoed the closing of a door on the last vestiges of their brotherhood. "We'll need to requisition your spare cot, ma'am," Jedediah said, turning to Elara, his tone formal again. "And we'll have to impose on your hospitality until the prisoner is fit to travel. I can offer payment for your trouble." "I don't want your money, Marshal," Elara said quietly. "Nevertheless, I'll see you're compensated." He glanced around the cabin again, his eyes finally resting on Cole's coat and knife on the mantel. He walked over, picked them up, and tucked the pistol into his own belt, handing the knife to Miller. "We'll stay the night," he announced. "We ride at first light, whether he's ready or not." The deputy took the first watch, positioning a chair near the door. Jedediah accepted a cup of coffee from Elara, his thanks gruff but sincere. Cole lay on the cot, his face turned to the wall. The silence from him more profound than any shout. The tiny cabin, once Elara's solitary sanctuary, now felt impossibly crowded. It held a wounded outlaw, a conflicted lawman, and a nervous deputy. And her, a woman caught in the crossfire of a family's bitter history. As night fell, blanketing the valley in an impenetrable darkness, Elara knew that the real storm had only just begun. The wounds she had tended were not just of the flesh, and the justice the Marshal sought was far from simple. The night was a long and suffocating ordeal. Elara lay on her own bed, a thin curtain separating her small alcove from the main room, but sleep was a distant country. Every creak of the floorboards, every from the wounded man, every rustle of the deputy on watch was magnified in the oppressive silence. The air was thick with unspoken words and simmering resentment. She felt like a prisoner in her own home. The presence of the two lawmen had transformed her sanctuary into a makeshift jail. Deputy Miller was a stout, uncommunicative man who seemed content to stare into the fire, but Marshal Blackwood was a different matter. His energy filled the room, a restless, brooding presence that was impossible to ignore. He was a man at war with himself, and the battlefield was Alara's hearth. Sometime after midnight, the watch changed. She heard the scrape of the chair as Miller got up, and the deeper voice of the Marshal telling him to get some sleep. The deputy retired to the cot they'd set up near the door, and soon his soft snores joined the crackle of the fire. Now it was just her, Cole, and Jedediah, surrounded by the sleeping world. Alara couldn't lie still any longer. She quietly rose, pulling a thick quilt around her shoulders, and padded into the main room. Jedediah was sitting by the fire, not in the watchman's chair, but in her own rocking chair, staring into the flames. He had Cole's confiscated Colt lying on the small table beside him, and he was slowly turning the misshapen slug she had pulled from his brother's side over and over in his fingers. He looked up as she approached, his blue eyes shadowed in the firelight. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "The cabin feels a bit crowded tonight," she replied, her tone neutral. She poured herself a cup of water from the bucket. "I apologize for the intrusion, Mrs. Hayes," he said formally. "This is not a situation I would have chosen." "And your brother, did he choose it?" The question was out before she could stop it. Jedediah's jaw tightened. He looked from her to the still form of his brother on the cot. "Cole has made his choices. He chose Croft's gang over an honest life. He chose a bank vault over a payroll. He chose a gun over a handshake. We all make our choices. And you," she pressed, emboldened by the lateness of the hour and the strange intimacy of the firelight. "What did you choose, Marshal? You said you didn't know what Silas Croft was, but your brother seems to think you did." He was silent for a long time, his gaze lost in the hypnotic dance of the flames. The tough, unyielding mask of the lawman had slipped, revealing the weary man beneath. "I knew he was a cheat," he admitted, his voice low, almost a confession. "A grifter. I knew he was bad company. But I never imagined he was capable of this." He gestured vaguely, encompassing the robbery, the shooting his brother's current state. "Cole was always wild, impulsive. He saw the glamour in men like Croft. The easy money, the freedom. I was trying to build something. A life. A reputation." "With Lillian," Alara said softly. He flinched, then gave a slow, weary nod. "With Lillian. Her father, Mr. Abernathy, owns the bank in Willow Creek. He's a powerful man. He expects propriety. Cole was an embarrassment, a liability. I thought if Croft took him under his wing, maybe he'd learn a trade cards or something and just drift on." "You pushed him away," she stated. "I did." He admitted, the words heavy with guilt. "I told myself it was for his own good, that he needed to stand on his own feet. But the truth is, I was ashamed of him, ashamed of where we came from. Our father was a drunkard and a thief. I spent my whole life trying to outrun that shadow. Cole." He seemed to be running right into it. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, pleading honesty. "I wanted to be better than my blood. Is that such a crime?" Before Alara could answer, a voice, weak but sharp, cut through the quiet. "The crime, brother, was lying to yourself." Cole had pushed himself up on one elbow. His face was pale in the dim light, but his eyes burned with a feverish intensity. He had been awake listening. Jedediah stiffened, the confession dying on his lips. He turned to face his brother. "You should be resting." "I've had enough rest," Cole rasped. "I've had a lot of time to think, lying in jail cells, lying in that creek. Mostly I think about you, about how you convinced everyone, even yourself, that you were the good son. I followed the law, Jedediah said, his voice regaining its hard edge. You followed Lillian, Cole corrected, and her father's money. You wanted to be a Blackwood in name only. You wanted to be an Abernathy. You left me behind, Jed. Don't you dare pretend it was for my own good. You did it for yourself. I gave you a choice. You gave me no choice at all. You brought me to that town. Then you told me I wasn't good enough to be seen with you. You introduced me to the only man who would talk to me, and then you walked away. Croft saw a lonely, angry kid who was good with a gun. What did you see? Jed, a problem you could palm off on someone else. Jedediah stood up, his fists clenched. Damn you, Cole. I'm already damned, Cole whispered, and the raw pain in his voice silenced the room. You saw to that. When Croft planned the Willow Creek bank job, Lillian's father's bank, I tried to back out. I told him no. He said I didn't have a choice. He said your future father-in-law had a lot of enemies. He said a man like you on the verge of marrying into so much money needed protection. He implied that if I didn't go along, something might happen. To you. Or to her. Elara gasped. This was a new, terrible twist. Cole wasn't just a willing participant. He had been trapped. Jedediah stared at his brother, his face a mess of confusion and dawning horror. What are you saying? I'm saying I robbed that bank to protect you. Cole said, his voice breaking. Croft played us both. He used my loyalty to you against me. I thought if I did that one job, he'd leave you alone. I thought I was saving you. He let out a bitter, rattling laugh. And for my trouble, my own brother hunted me down, threw me in prison. And when I broke out, you hunted me again. You shot me, Jed. Or did your deputy do it for you? I didn't, Jedediah stammered, looking from his brother's accusing eyes to the gun on the table. The guard at the transport. You shot him. I shot the gun out of his hand when he was about to execute another prisoner. It was self-defense. Ask the other men in that wagon. But you wouldn't do that, would you? You'd just take the word of the law. The foundation of Jedediah Blackwood's world was crumbling around him. The clear lines he had drawn between right and wrong, between himself and his brother, were dissolving into a murky, grey torrent of lies and half-truths. He looked like a man who had been shot himself, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. He sank back into the chair. The Marshal's bravado gone, replaced by the raw agony of a man confronting a devastating truth. I didn't know, he whispered. Cole, I swear to God I didn't know. No. Cole said, his voice flat and empty. You didn't want to know. It was easier to see me as the villain. It made you the hero of the story. He lay back down, pulling the blanket up. His face turned away. The conversation was over. A heavy silence descended on the cabin once more. But this time it was different. It was the silence of revelation of shattered illusions. Elara looked at the two brothers, one branded an outlaw, the other wearing a badge, and saw two men equally imprisoned by their past. She looked at Jedediah. The righteous anger was gone, replaced by a profound, agonizing guilt. He picked up the deformed slug from the table and stared at it as if the truth of everything was written in its twisted lead. He was the law. But he was beginning to understand that the law and justice were not always the same thing. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the window, Elara knew one thing for certain: they would not be riding out at first light. The story of Cole and Jedediah Blackwood was far from over, and her small, isolated cabin had become the unlikely stage for its final fateful act. The dawn brought no clarity, only a deeper sense of complication. The air in the cabin was thick with the fallout of the night's revelations. Deputy Miller awoke, sensing the shift in atmosphere, and moved with a quiet uncertainty, his usual gruffness replaced by a watchful curiosity. Jedediah was a changed man. The stern mask of the U.S. Marshal had been shattered, and in its place was the haunted face of a brother, wrestling with a terrible burden of guilt. He avoided looking at Cole, who remained on the cot, a silent, brooding presence. He couldn't bring himself to give the order to leave. The righteous certainty that had driven him was gone, replaced by a paralyzing doubt. Elara became the quiet center of their fractured world. She moved about the cabin with a calm purpose, stoking the fire, making coffee, and checking Cole's wound. The bandage needed changing. As she gently unwrapped the linen, she saw that the skin around the stitches was red and inflamed. His fever, which had broken, was beginning to return. "He's not going anywhere," she announced to the room, her voice firm. "This wound is starting to fester. If he rides now, he'll be dead in 2 days from blood poisoning." Jedediah looked at his brother, a fresh wave of pain crossing his face. "What does he need?" "Rest, clean water, more willow bark tea for the fever." She looked directly at him. "And he needs you to stop seeing him as a prisoner and start seeing him as a man who needs help." The directness of her words struck home. Jedediah nodded slowly, a silent capitulation. The law would have to wait. For now they were simply 3 people and a wounded man trapped by the snow and by the past. For the next 2 days, a strange, unspoken truce settled over the cabin. Deputy Miller, under Jedediah's quiet orders, helped Elara chop more wood and haul water. He was a simple man, a follower of orders, and with the Marshal's iron will wavering, he seemed relieved to have simple physical tasks to perform. Jedediah was a ghost at his own brother's bedside. He would stand for long periods, just watching Cole sleep, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions. He tried to speak to him once, his voice low and halting. "Cole, about what you said, about Croft." Cole, his eyes closed, simply turned his head away, a clear and final rejection. The chasm between them was too wide to be bridged by a few hesitant words. Elara found herself becoming an intermediary, a translator of silences. She would tell Jedediah about Cole's condition, and she would tell Cole that his brother had helped fetch the water to boil for his bandages. She was a neutral territory in their Cold War. On the 3rd day after the Marshal's arrival, as Elara was outside shaking out a blanket, she saw a figure on horseback in the distance. Not on the track to the cabin, but cutting across the high ridge to the west. It was a lone rider, moving with purpose. A flicker of unease went through her. This valley was her sanctuary, because no one ever came here. Now it seemed to be getting crowded. She went back inside. "Marshal," she said quietly, "I think you should see this." Jedediah and Miller joined her at the window. They watched the distant rider for a moment. "Who is that?" Miller asked. "I don't know," Jedediah said, his voice tight with suspicion. "But he's not lost. He's surveying the valley." His hand instinctively went to the Colt tucked in his belt, Cole's gun. "The rest of Croft's gang. It has to be. They must be looking for him, or looking to silence him." The implication hung heavy in the air. Cole wasn't just a fugitive from the law. he was a liability to his former partners. He was the only one who could tie Silas Croft directly to the Willow Creek robbery with a believable testimony, especially the part about the blackmail. "What do we do, Marshal?" Miller asked, his nervousness returning. Jedediah's transformation was immediate and startling. The doubt and guilt vanished, replaced by the sharp, decisive focus of the lawman he was trained to be. This was a threat he understood. This was an enemy he could fight. "We prepare," he said, his voice cold as steel. "Miller, bar the door and the window shutters. Don't make it obvious, just look like we're settling in for the night. Mrs. Hayes, I need every gun you have." "Just the Winchester," she said, her heart beginning to pound. "And my rifle is on my saddle," Jedediah said, "plus my own service revolver and this one." He patted Cole's Colt. "That gives us 4 firearms." He turned and walked over to the cot. Cole was awake, his eyes following the distant rider through a crack in the shuttered window. He had heard everything. "Jed," he said, his voice a low rasp. "That's probably Ben Carter, Croft's right hand. He's as loyal as a snake, which means he's only loyal to himself. If Croft sent him, it's to make sure I never talk to a judge." The "we" was unspoken, but it was there. In the face of a common enemy, the chasm between them had momentarily vanished. They were brothers again. "Can you shoot?" Jedediah asked. Cole pushed himself into a sitting position, gritting his teeth against the pain. "Prop me up in the corner. I can hold a pistol." Jedediah gave a curt nod. He walked to the mantelpiece where his own gun belt lay and took out his Colt. He walked back and handed it to Cole. Their hands touched for a brief moment as the gun passed between them. It was the first time they had made physical contact since the shackles. It was a pardon, an alliance, and an apology, all in one simple gesture. "Mrs. Hayes," Jedediah said, turning to her, "I never wanted to bring this violence to your door. I need you to go into the root cellar. It's the safest place." Elara looked at him, at the grim determination in his face. She looked at Cole, pale and sweating, but with a fierce light in his eyes, clutching his brother's gun. She looked at the sturdy walls of the cabin she had built with her own 2 hands. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "This is my home. You will not ask me to hide in my own cellar while strangers try to tear it down. Give me my Winchester. I know how to use it." Jedediah studied her for a long moment, then a look of profound respect dawned in his eyes. He nodded. "All right, Mrs. Hayes. To your post." As dusk began to fall, the cabin was transformed into a small, desperate fortress. Miller took one window, Elara the other. Jedediah stood by the door, and Cole was propped up in the far corner, his gun resting on a crate, his eyes fixed on the darkening landscape outside. The waiting was the worst part. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The fire was banked low, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. The wind howled outside, a perfect cover for an approaching enemy. Then they heard it, the soft crunch of snow. Not one set of feet, but several. They were coming. A voice called out from the darkness, smooth and confident. "Cole Blackwood, I know you're in there. So is your brother, the good Marshal. Silas Croft sends his regards. He says he'd like to tie up a few loose ends. Come on out, and we can make this easy." Jedediah didn't answer. He held up a hand, signaling for silence. "Don't be like that," the voice, Carter's voice, called again, closer now. "We know you're hurt. We know you're outnumbered. There are 4 of us. Just send out Cole, and the rest of you can walk away. The Marshal, the lady. No one else needs to get hurt." Inside the cabin, Cole coughed a racking, painful sound. "He's lying, Jed. He'll kill us all as witnesses." "I know," Jedediah whispered back. Suddenly the night exploded. A gunshot shattered the window next to Elara, sending splinters of wood and glass flying. She flinched, but held her ground, her knuckles white on the stock of the Winchester. Another shot slammed into the heavy oak door. "Last chance!" Carter yelled. Jedediah's answer was a single deafening gunshot. He fired through the door, and a cry of pain from outside told him he'd found a mark. The siege began. Gunshots erupted from all sides, a hailstorm of lead slamming into the log walls of the cabin. The air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and the smell of burnt powder. Elara, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, began to fire back, aiming at the muzzle flashes that lit up the darkness. She wasn't aiming to kill, just to keep them back to protect her home. It was a chaotic, terrifying symphony of violence. Through it all, Jedediah was a rock. He called out orders, his voice calm and steady, directing their fire. "Miller to your left, Elara. Watch the trees. Cole, save your shots." A bullet tore through the wall just above Cole's head. He didn't even flinch. He was waiting, his eyes narrowed for a clear shot. He saw a shadow dart between two trees and fired. The shadow dropped with a grunt. "One down." He rasped, a grim satisfaction in his voice. The fight raged on. They were holding their own, but they were trapped. Croft's men were content to lay siege to wear them down. As the hours crept by, Elara felt a growing sense of despair. Their ammunition wouldn't last forever. Cole's strength was fading. She could see the sweat pouring down his face. Then she heard a new sound, a scraping, scratching noise from the back of the cabin near the hearth. "Jedediah," she hissed. "The chimney." One of Croft's men was trying to climb onto the roof, likely to drop something flammable or a stick of dynamite down the chimney. "I'm out of bullets," Miller yelled from his window. "Cole," Jedediah shouted. "One shot left," he replied. "Make it count," Jedediah said. He grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. "When I open the door, give me cover." It was a desperate, insane plan. He was going to face them head-on. "No, Jed, don't!" Cole cried out. But it was too late. With a roar, Jedediah threw open the door and charged into the darkness, the poker held like a club. The remaining two gunmen, surprised by his sudden appearance, turned their fire on him. In that split second of distraction, Cole saw his chance. Ben Carter, thinking himself safe, stood up from behind a fallen log to get a clear shot at Jedediah. Cole lifted his pistol with both trembling hands, took a deep breath, and fired his last bullet. Carter cried out and staggered back, clutching his shoulder, his rifle falling into the snow. At the same moment, Jedediah closed the distance to the other man and swung the poker with all his might. The sickening crunch of impact was followed by a groan as the man crumpled to the ground. Silence. Jedediah stood panting in the snow-covered clearing, surrounded by the still or wounded forms of their attackers. He had done it. He had protected them. He turned and stumbled back toward the cabin, a dark stain spreading across his own sleeve. He'd been hit. "Jed!" Cole cried out, trying to get to his feet. Elara rushed to the door to help him inside. He collapsed into a chair, his face pale. The bullet had grazed his arm. It was a flesh wound, but he was bleeding freely. The battle was over. They had won. Elara looked from the wounded Marshal to his brother, who was slumped against the wall. His gun empty, his face ashen with exhaustion and fever. They had fought together back to back. In the heat of battle, the titles of lawman and outlaw had been burned away. They were just brothers, protecting each other, protecting her. The thaw had begun not just in the weather outside, but in the frozen landscape of their hearts. But as she moved to tend to Jedediah's wound, she knew the fight for their future was far from over. Silas Croft was still out there, and the law, however complicated and unjust it now seemed, would still demand its due. The smoke cleared, but the future remained clouded. In that small Montana cabin, 3 lives were forever changed. Jedediah, faced with the truth, had to choose between the brother he'd wronged and the law he'd sworn to uphold. Cole, having fought for his life and his brother's, saw a glimmer of a future he never thought possible. And Elara, the solitary homesteader, found herself at the heart of their story, her courage forging an unbreakable bond with 2 men from opposite sides of the law. Their journey was far from over. The road ahead was fraught with danger from Croft's vengeance and the long arm of the law. What happens next? That, my friends, is a story for another time. Thank you for joining us for this tale of drama and redemption in the Old West. If you were on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit that like button. Share this video with a friend who loves a good Western, and most importantly, subscribe and ring that notification bell. We have many more stories from the frontier to share, and you won't want to miss a single one. Let us know in the comments what you think Elara should do next.